Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission, as always, is pretty direct. We take a stack of compelling, sometimes challenging source material, we cut through all the noise, and we try to give you the core insights so you can walk away thoroughly informed.
And today, we are embarking on a particularly challenging deep dive. The material we're analyzing frames its argument in some really stark, very powerful terms. We are examining Volume 1 of a political pamphlet series titled The Decline and Fall of the American Civilization.
Okay.
And this specific volume, Volume 1, it zeroes in on a topic it calls corporate power and privilege.
Okay, let's just unpack this right away. I mean, that title alone, it suggests a monumental failure. And what's interesting is that the sources, they don't seem to focus on external enemies or foreign threats.
Not at all.
The foundational premise here is that the erosion of American civilization, as they put it, stems from internal rot. So what's our mission here, tackling such a heavy critique?
Well, our mission is to structurally dissect this argument. The pamphlet's framework is very clear. It claims that power has been systematically captured by corporate interests and that accountability, consequences for failure has just utterly evaporated from the system.
Right.
So we're here to extract the key points of their diagnosis. We want to understand precisely who the authors claim benefited from this historical shift, and I think most importantly for the average person who ended up paying the full price.
And just to be crystal clear for everyone listening,
Yes.
we are dissecting the claim. We're not endorsing the political viewpoint. We're here to understand the argument being made.
Exactly. That clarity is absolutely essential.
So this volume, Corporate Power and Privilege, it seems to hinge on one central historical argument about the American promise itself. What is that core claim?
The author posits that the fundamental American promise, this whole idea of liberty, justice, and earned opportunity, it wasn't shattered all at once. It wasn't one single event.
Not like a sudden explosion.
No, not at all. Instead, it was, and this is the quote, slowly sold off. The argument suggests this process happened incrementally through thousands and thousands of decisions made quietly, often, way outside of the public view. And this created a structural imbalance where certain institutions just became immune to the rules that govern the rest of society.
Okay, so if the promise was sold off, we first had to define what the sources argue that promise actually was. Let's dig into that idealized vision they present in the opening chapters.
The pamphlet uses this really powerful, almost mythic language. It describes the initial vision of America as a shining city on a hill.
The classic line.
The classic line. And this wasn't just geographical, it was a moral and economic vision. It was based on the belief that merit determined reward, that opportunities were available to those who worked hard, and that the system, while it was never perfect, fundamentally upheld justice.
So the core idea was, if you play by the rules, if you contribute, the system will, in the end, reward you.
That was the moral concept, yes. But the sources argue that this foundation just fractured. They state that the promise was betrayed from within, in corporate boardrooms, rather than by some external enemy.
So what was the mechanism of that betrayal? How did it happen?
The fracture, the author argues, occurred when core values were deliberately transformed into marketable commodities. And this is where the depth of the critique, I think, really take shape. The pillars of a stable, functioning society, those things that you could argue should be shared trusts, they became these high-cost products only available based on your economic status.
Okay, can you elaborate on that transformation?
Yeah.
What specific examples does the pamphlet cite for, services being turned into products?
Well, they focus on four main areas, and they spend a lot of time on each. First, you have healthcare. It stopped being a guaranteed societal safety net and became this increasingly expensive bureaucratic product that's tied directly to your job.
Which leaves millions of people totally vulnerable.
Exactly. Uninsured or underinsured, making critical care a luxury item. Then second, there's education. It was supposed to be the engine of opportunity, right?
Right. It's a great equalizer.
But today, the sources claim it has become a crippling debt trap. Students graduate with degrees they absolutely need for even entry-level work, but they're burdened with debt that can last for decades. It fundamentally undermines the very upward mobility that education was supposed to provide.
And what about beyond education and healthcare?
The third is housing. The sources argue housing was stripped of its real purpose, shelter and security for families, and it became a pure speculative asset. a tool for financial engineering and wealth concentration, which makes basic ownership just unattainable for so many working families today.
And the fourth one.
The fourth, and this is maybe the darkest part of the critique, the pamphlet insists that democracy itself has been reduced to a brand.
A brand.
Yes, an industry shaped by enormous influence campaigns, lobbying, big money, where the voices of actual citizens are just drowned out by the sheer volume of corporate spending.
That reframing from a shared societal good to a high-priced commodity is a really powerful rhetorical device. And it sets the stage for what the pamphlet describes as the new corporate ethos. It's a statement that is, frankly, frighteningly concise. Risk was socialized, but profit was privatized.
And what this means structurally, according to the critique, is that a fundamental asymmetry was built right into the system. When massive businesses faced failure, that risk was transferred to the public balance sheet.
So absorbed by taxpayers.
Absorbed by taxpayers and felt by communities through job losses and, economic shock. However, when those same businesses experience success, often driven by market dominance or even public subsidies, the enormous profits were channeled straight upward to executives and shareholders, completely bypassing the public that absorbed all the initial risks.
So just to be clear, the public absorbs the downside, but never gets to share in the upside. That sounds like a system designed for pure extraction.
It is precisely labeled as extraction. And the pamphlet observes the chilling terminology that's used to mask the human cost of this ethos. If people suffer or die, if jobs are shipped offshore, if safety systems are cut, if communities are polluted, all in the pursuit of greater profit, the sources claim that outcome is just rebranded and normalized.
How so?
It's labeled as necessary efficiency. Or, in the most cynical terms, it's just collateral damage that has to be accepted for the sake of the market.
The narrative suggests this wasn't an accident, but the result of institutional decay. This leads to this idea of the rot within. The source material claims the most dangerous lie Americans were told wasn't that the country was perfect, but that it was fundamentally incapable of failing.
And that sense of invincibility, that's what led to complacency. It allowed the rot to flourish quietly. The sources argue that civilization decays when its institutions like regulatory bodies, the courts, even the media, stop serving the public interest and start serving only the powerful.
And the crack in the foundation happens when people realize the rules don't apply to everyone equally.
Exactly. When the citizenry recognizes that the rules of the game apply differently based purely on wealth and influence. Once that foundational belief in fairness disappears, the willingness to participate or, to sacrifice for the common good, it diminishes dramatically. That systemic unfairness, according to this analysis, is the true signal of decline.
But critics of this pamphlet might argue that powerful corporations are just, tools of capitalism constantly adapting. How does the expert framing in the pamphlet address the structural critique, this shift from a traditional market economy to what they call an oligarchic one?
That's where the analysis provides some really crucial technical detail. Traditionally, the corporation was a temporary legal structure, a tool chartered by the state for a specific public purpose, like building a railroad or providing a utility. If it failed to serve the public or became insolvent, it dissolved.
It just went away.
It went away. The authors argue that today, the largest corporations operate as permanent, almost untouchable institutions. They don't just exist within the law, they actively shape the law.
So how does that shaping happen specifically?
The sources spend a lot of time detailing regulatory capture. This is the process where corporations use these massive lobbying budgets and the revolving door, where former regulators take lucrative jobs at the companies they once monitored, and vice versa, to write the very regulations that are meant to restrain them.
They're essentially grading their own homework.
That's a great way to put it. The pamphlet provides examples across finance, environmental protection, telecommunications. It means influence replaces merit. Size protects you from failure. If your company is large enough to deploy significant political capital, you can essentially grant yourself immunity from any serious consequence. That, the sources insist, is the definition of an oligarchic system, not a competitive market.
Okay, so if that's the structural theory of the decline, where do the authors argue the entire public saw the promise demonstrably broken and the rot fully exposed? I have a feeling I know the answer. It's probably 2008.
It is the critical chapter in this volume. The 2008 financial collapse serves as the definitive case study where this concept of socialized risk, privatized profit, was executed on a global scale in full public view.
And the 4 words that justified that, according to the pamphlet, were Too big to fail. The sources characterize this phrase as the ultimate moral escape hatch.
That's exactly right. That phrase justified using billions, which eventually became trillions of taxpayer dollars, to rescue institutions that had engaged in what the authors call reckless, irresponsible, and in some cases, fraudulent gambling with other people's money.
It sent a clear signal.
It signaled that certain institutions had reached a level of systemic importance that exempted them from the natural law of the market, which is failure.
Let's get into the specific mechanics of the bailout for the deep dive listener. The sources reference legislation like TARP. What does the pamphlet say about the speed and the atmosphere of that intervention and the disparity it created?
Well, the pamphlet details the atmosphere as one of manufactured panic. Congress was told a total collapse was imminent, hours away, and the vote for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, had to be rushed through. This emergency intervention delivered hundreds of billions in capital injections to banks, insurance companies, auto manufacturers.
But the real damage, the structural damage, was the immediate disparity in consequences.
That was it. The disparity between who caused the crisis and who paid for it.
And the disparity being the institutions that caused the crisis walked away largely unscathed.
Correct. The wealthy, the banks, the financial institutions, and the executives, they received those billions. And the sources meticulously document how quickly those bailout funds translated into immediate executive bonuses, stock buybacks, and restored functionality. They were back to business as usual, even as the institutions responsible for the crisis resumed essentially the same reckless behavior.
Meanwhile, the reality for ordinary people was the complete opposite. They were facing mass foreclosures, they lost their retirement savings, they lost their jobs, and they were told by the very same system to accept austerity, tighten their belts, and be patient.
And patience, as the sources note with some really heavy irony, was strictly demanded only from those without power or a political voice. The author uses the contrast between the lightning speed of the corporate rescue and the bureaucratic paralysis of foreclosure mitigation efforts to great effect. Millions of people lost their homes.
And how many top executives went to jail?
Practically zero. Zero top executives faced any meaningful legal consequence, prosecution, or jail time.
That contrast, the pamphlet argues, taught a really dangerous, lasting lesson to corporate leadership.
That lesson is the very definition of moral hazard. The system taught executives that risk was no longer a personal or a corporate liability, as long as the organization was large enough and politically connected enough to coerce a bailout.
So risk management became less important than political management.
Exactly. The authors explicitly label this environment corporate socialism for the wealthy, stating that the system protects the powerful from the consequences of their own incompetence.
That is a harsh assessment. But the sources even bring in Milton Friedman, the architect of free market theory, to underscore the hypocrisy of this corporate welfare.
And this is what's genuinely clever about the pamphlet's argument. They utilize a champion of free markets, like Friedman, to critique the supposed rescue. Friedman was unequivocal that markets require failure. Failure is the essential mechanism that maintains discipline, that forces innovation, that punishes incompetence.
It clears out the dead wood, so to speak.
It clears out the dead wood and reallocates capital to better performing ventures. The pamphlet argues that the bailouts didn't preserve capitalism. They corrupted it by granting immunity to those who should have failed. By protecting the worst players, the system guaranteed that the moral rot would just continue.
But let's play the devil's advocate here, as we should. Critics would argue that an immediate collapse would have plunged the world into a second Great Depression, making the bailouts a necessary, if painful, choice to save the entire system. How does the pamphlet address that necessity argument?
The author does acknowledge the potential for systemic collapse, but argues that the execution of the bailout was fatally flawed and deliberate in its design. The necessity argument, they claim, was used as leverage to ensure that the risk-takers were protected, not just the market stability.
So what was the alternative?
They highlight that the government could have rescued the assets and the functions of the banks while imposing harsh penalties on the shareholders and the executives. Instead, the primary political effort, the pamphlet states, was centered on restoring the status quo and protecting the exact wealth structure that had caused the crisis in the first place.
So the choice wasn't between saving the economy or letting it burn.
No. The pamphlet argues the choice was between demanding accountability from the powerful or letting them walk free, and they argue that the U.S. chose the latter.
This leads directly to the core of the political critique. The perceived hypocrisy of corporate welfare versus social safety nets.
It's labeled a selective contempt. The sources detail how widely and often how viciously politicians and media figures condemn handouts or entitlement culture or dependency when they're discussing social programs intended to help struggling citizens, veterans, seniors, the poor, unemployed families.
Those programs are treated as a moral failing that needs to be heavily policed.
Exactly. But when corporate aid is on the table, the language instantly flips.
Completely.
Bailouts are reframed as stabilization or prudent policy. Subsidies become incentives that are necessary for job creation or competitiveness.
Yeah.
Aid for struggling families is scrutinized down to the dollar, requiring years of paperwork, imposing strict eligibility rules, delays, denials.
But the pamphlet insists that corporate aid is rushed through, often in the dead of night, with only the single necessary question: how much do you need?
This favoritism is argued to be a profound betrayal of the public contract. And furthermore, the same voices that demand fiscal responsibility and balanced budgets suddenly find trillions of dollars when corporate interests are at stake. The demand for restraint and austerity, the sources conclude, only seems to apply when funds are being directed toward healthcare, education, or veterans' benefits. It disappears entirely when the ultra-wealthy need a guarantee against failure.
The sources offer a fascinating historical parallel to drive home this dramatic shift in who absorbs the risk, comparing the 2008 intervention with the economic crisis of 1893.
And this contrast is clearly designed to shock the listener by demonstrating that public risk absorption was not always the norm. The Panic of 1893, it was triggered by over-speculation and the instability of the gold standard, and it caused a severe run on the U.S. Treasury's gold reserves. It brought them dangerously low.
So the collapse of the national currency was a very real threat.
A very real threat.
So who stepped in to save the nation's finances back then?
It was private capital. In 1895, President Grover Cleveland sought help. The sources detail how J.P. Morgan, in collaboration with August Belmont, who is representing European banking interests, including the Rothschild family, orchestrated a private syndicate deal. They lent the U.S. Treasury $65 million in gold to stabilize the reserve. This was a private intervention to stabilize public finances.
And the stark inversion is that in 2008, the public was effectively forced to intervene, absorbing trillions of dollars in risk to stabilize private financiers.
Exactly. And the source uses this parallel to ask a really profound question about national commitment. Do the modern ultra-wealthy, the Bezos, the Musks, the Zuckerbergs, do they possess the same sense of national commitment that would prompt them to step in privately to bear the burden of a national crisis?
Or do they just expect the taxpayer to absorb the risk while they simultaneously evade taxes and externalize costs?
That's the question the pamphlet poses. It argues that the switch from private responsibility intervening for the public good to public mandate absorbing private risk is the clearest sign of the system's capture.
That sets the stage perfectly for Section 3, which transitions from this high-level structural theory to the tangible human costs of this alleged rigged system. And the pamphlet uses the experience of veterans as the most painful example of the system's selective unfairness.
Yeah, this section powerfully argues that those who have made the ultimate sacrifice are constantly undermined by the very system they fought to protect. The expectation that military service ensures the nation will not abandon you is treated as conditional, bureaucratic, and ultimately punitive.
Oh, I want to focus on a specific injustice the author cites to illustrate this institutional cruelty: the debt trap for disabled veterans.
This is used as the emotional and moral center of the chapter. Historically, disabled veterans whose student loans were discharged because their service-connected injuries rendered them unable to work, which is a compassionate move by the Education Department, were simultaneously hit with a large federal tax bill from the IRS.
Why?
Because the discharge was counted as taxable income.
The sources cite a specific, just heartbreaking example of a $33,000 tax bill, which many veterans were forced to pay off for years. This bill wasn't incurred because they earned money, but because they became disabled and unable to earn money.
And the author asks you, the reader, to just dwell on the logic of that. The government determines you are disabled enough to discharge your debt, but not disabled enough to be spared a crushing tax penalty for that same discharge. It is compliance followed immediately by financial punishment.
A total systemic failure.
It underscores the pamphlet's claim that the machinery of the state lacks empathy and operates only on rules designed to extract wealth, even from the most vulnerable citizens.
And this bureaucratic gauntlet that veterans face is contrasted directly with the ease with which corporations receive relief and tax advantages.
Right. While veterans are navigating years of paperwork, constantly having to revalidate their injuries, facing lost records, long wait times, a system basically designed to test their endurance and patience.
Corporations get immediate relief.
Immediate expedited relief. Executives negotiate directly with cabinet members. Their financial rescue arrives without any moral judgment or requirement to justify their necessity. The veteran is questioned incessantly. The corporation is simply trusted.
This brings us to the next layer of extraction described, the wealth exemption, or tax avoidance, by the modern elite. The core premise here is that the more wealth you have, the less you contribute proportionally to the system that sustains you.
The sources claim that once wealth reaches a certain critical mass, it ceases to be mere capital, and it transforms into raw political power. This is the power to influence law, not necessarily to break existing laws, but to fund the refinement of the legal system itself to protect and grow that capital.
So they're not breaking the law, they're writing the law.
In effect, billionaires operate within this complex, sophisticated legal architecture that is continuously designed to shield capital from the obligations that apply to wage earners.
Let's look at the specific examples the pamphlet uses to illustrate this point, starting with Elon Musk.
The argument concerning Musk focuses heavily on the reliance of his companies on public capital and support, contrasted with his alleged minimization of his personal tax burden. The pamphlet points out that SpaceX and Tesla benefit significantly from government subsidies, tax breaks, and enormous defense contracts.
Like Starlink.
Right. Starlink is cited as a critical piece of national security infrastructure used by the U.S. military and emergency services. Yet, simultaneously, the sources claim that Musk's personal tax contributions are, quote, little to nothing compared to his astronomical growth and wealth.
And what about the contrast in labor practices the sources draw attention to?
Well, the pamphlet highlights allegations of his companies aggressively opposing unionization, high-pressure, often unsafe working conditions reported by employees, and retaliation against workers who criticize leadership behavior. The critique is rooted in hypocrisy. You're benefiting massively from the public system, its infrastructure, its contracts, its legal protection, while simultaneously resisting the social obligations like fair tax contribution and stable labor practices that define a functional society.
Okay, next up, Jeff Bezos and Amazon. The sources state that Amazon relies heavily on public infrastructure and taxpayer-funded research, yet for years paid little to no federal income tax despite massive profits. How did they legally achieve this avoidance?
The pamphlet explains the sophisticated legal mechanisms. The primary tools they cite include massive amounts of accelerated depreciation, writing off investments in warehouses and equipment far faster than they physically wear out, which artificially lowers their taxable income.
So it's a paper loss, not a real one.
Exactly. They also use tax credits for R&D and, critically, stock-based executive compensation. By paying executives in stock options rather than salary, the company gets a massive deduction on its payroll costs, which further reduces its taxable profit even as the stock price is soaring.
So they're using these legal maneuvers to report minimal taxable profit while simultaneously relying on public roads, ports, and a publicly educated workforce, all funded by the taxes they are actively avoiding.
Precisely. The sources argued that while Amazon workers faced grueling warehouse conditions and injury rates above industry averages, placing strain on public healthcare and disability systems, the company itself was insulated from contributing its proportional share of federal income tax. The profits, the authors conclude, are intensely private. The damage and the reliance on infrastructure are entirely shared.
And finally, the sources characterize Mark Zuckerberg and Meta as controlling a global information infrastructure, shaping elections and public discourse on a planetary scale.
The critique here is less about direct tax avoidance and more about accountability for societal harm. Despite repeated global scandals involving algorithmic amplification of polarization, data misuse, interference in democratic processes, all profound social costs, the accountability imposed by governments has been limited.
Just fines, basically.
Right. Often small fines that are merely a fraction of their quarterly profits. Zuckerberg's wealth continues to grow exponentially, which reinforces the pamphlet's central thesis. Private individuals now control public critical infrastructure with zero corresponding public accountability or personal consequence.
The expert analysis here emphasizes the core implication of this widespread tax avoidance. This isn't just about fairness, it's about the erosion of civilization itself.
This is a fundamental structural point. The author states emphatically, taxes are not a punishment, they are the price of civilization. They are the funds that build the roads, defend the global networks, staff the veteran support offices, and ensure a stable environment where businesses can thrive. When the wealthiest, who benefit most dramatically from that stability, successfully avoid paying their proportional share, the entire burden shifts downward.
It falls on everyone else.
It falls onto the shoulders of wage workers, small businesses, seniors, and, painfully, veterans. This, according to the sources, is not innovation. It is a systematic legal extraction from the very foundation of the state.
So if the modern elite operates under this extraction model, the pamphlet offers a powerful counter-narrative in Section 4, a tale of two industrial traditions. This section is critical because it aims to prove that industry and moral responsibility were not always mutually exclusive.
And that is the crucial proof point. The pamphlet uses these historical figures to counter the argument that social responsibility is impossible or anti-competitive. They insist the problem isn't feasibility, it's the modern lack of corporate will.
Let's start with the industrial patriots, focusing on Henry J. Kaiser during World War II, known as the father of American shipbuilding.
Kaiser's story is used to exemplify wartime industrial patriotism. When the German U-boats were sinking Allied supply ships faster than they could be replaced, national survival was literally at stake. Kaiser introduced these revolutionary assembly line methods to shipbuilding, drastically cutting production time. He famously had one shipyard produce a Liberty ship, a vessel that typically took months to build in just 4 days and 15 hours.
An incredible feat.
His contribution was undeniable national service. But the truly instructive part, for the purpose of this pamphlet, is his commitment to worker welfare, which directly contradicts the modern notion that cutting worker costs is the only way to achieve efficiency.
Right.
Kaiser saw labor as essential capital, not as disposable overhead. Shipyard work was incredibly dangerous, leading to high rates of injury and then absenteeism. Kaiser's radical solution was to establish on-site medical clinics directly at the shipyards. Doctors and nurses were there 247 to treat injuries immediately, minimizing downtime and demonstrating a clear human commitment to his workforce.
And these clinics, the sources explain, are the historical foundation of the massive health consortium we know today as Kaiser Permanente.
That's a key detail. The system was founded on the principle that providing preventative and immediate care was both a moral responsibility and ultimately the most efficient way to run a national-scale industrial operation. Furthermore, you had this rapid influx of workers to industrial centers, which created a severe housing crisis.
And Kaiser didn't wait for the government.
He didn't wait for bureaucracy. He personally financed and built large-scale worker housing projects near his shipyards, complete with schools and community centers. He recognized that you cannot demand peak industrial sacrifice from a workforce if you ignore their fundamental needs for stable shelter and family life.
So he was integrating the cost of civilization, healthcare, housing, community stability directly into his business model during a time of national crisis.
And succeeding wildly. This stabilized his workforce, reduced absenteeism, and allowed him to maintain the peak production needed for the war effort. The pamphlet argues that Kaiser understood that the welfare of the nation and the welfare of his workers were one and the same, a stark contrast to the modern model of externalizing all social costs.
The sources also cite earlier examples, like Robert Owen in the 1800s.
Owen, a Welsh industrialist, managed the new Lanark textile mills. In the grim era of the Industrial Revolution, where child labor and brutal working hours were standard, Owen adopted truly radical policies. He banned child labor under the age of 10, significantly reduced working hours, and invested heavily in schools and clean, affordable housing for his employees.
And what was his philosophy?
His guiding philosophy was that human character was shaped by its environment. He argued that if you treat people with dignity, they become better workers, better citizens, and productivity actually improves sustainably.
And another name that stands out is George Westinghouse.
Right. Westinghouse is celebrated not just for his contributions to the electrical system, but for his prioritization of safety. He invented the air brake, which dramatically reduced the terrifying death toll on railroads. But beyond his inventions, he voluntarily adopted the 8-hour workday long before it was a legal requirement. His belief was that industrial accidents were caused by fatigue, not laziness.
Which demonstrates a critical connection between worker well-being and industrial efficacy.
It was a culture that linked innovation directly to reducing human cost.
Now let's contrast this historical tradition, Kaiser, Owen, Westinghouse, with the modern elite, characterized by the extraction model, using the pamphlet's specific arguments.
The core divergence is philosophical. The earlier industrialists saw workers as essential human capital that required investment. The modern model, the sources claim, treats labor as a fungible commodity and an overhead expense to be minimized. Modern companies focus on cutting labor costs and externalizing the social safety net, relying on public systems to support their low-wage workers or cover their medical expenses.
And the sources use Elon Musk as a primary contrast to Kaiser's industrial patriotism.
Yes. While Kaiser's legacy is rooted in national service and creating an enduring health system, the pamphlet critiques Musk's corporate culture based on numerous public reports and lawsuits. They highlight alleged racial discrimination issues at Tesla facilities, citing significant court cases involving racial slurs and harassment. Furthermore, the alleged culture of extreme hours, aggressive anti-union opposition, and the firing of employees who criticize leadership behavior at SpaceX. All of this demonstrates a perceived detachment from the welfare and stability of the workforce.
So the contrast is Kaiser building housing and clinics versus a modern focus on output targets regardless of the human cost.
That's the argument being made.
The pamphlet also raises the question of military service and patriotism, contrasting historical figures who came from privilege and served actively with modern figures who has not.
And this point is used to question the meaning of modern patriotism within the corporate elite. The sources explicitly note that neither Donald Trump nor Elon Musk have served in the military. This is immediately contrasted with historical figures from backgrounds of high privilege. James Roosevelt, the son of FDR, Ted Roosevelt Jr., who earned the Medal of Honor at D-Day, George H.W. Bush, and John F. Kennedy, all of whom served actively, often in combat, despite their privileged status.
The pamphlet goes into detail about the scrutiny surrounding Donald Trump's service record, particularly his 5 draft deferments, culminating in a medical deferment for bone spurs.
And the source material positions this history against the profound sacrifice of others, specifically citing Senator John McCain, who refused early release from a North Vietnamese prison camp despite his father being a high-ranking admiral. The argument is that the historical elite often prioritized putting the country's needs and risks above their own personal safety.
Whereas the modern model, the sources claim, emphasizes insulating oneself from all risk while expecting others, specifically the working class and veterans, to absorb it.
That's the claim. So the core difference between the two industrial traditions is that the Kaiser model built social trust, shared stability, and linked success to the national good.
And the modern model, the pamphlet argues, builds extreme concentration of wealth, creates systems that are publicly dependent on private power, and explicitly separates success from civic obligation.
And the lack of will to assume social responsibility, they conclude, has led to the structural decline they've been documenting.
So we have established the pamphlet's argument. The alleged decline stems from unchecked corporate power, this economic asymmetry, and the erosion of the belief that fairness is still possible in the American system.
And the author brings the entire critique to a head in the final chapters with a demand for accountability, starting with the premise. Power without responsibility is pure exploitation. They revisit the history of the corporation itself.
This brings us back to the legal structure. Historically, corporate charters were limited and revocable.
Exactly. Corporate charters were finite. If a company engaged in systemic harm, violated public trust, or failed its intended purpose, the state could theoretically revoke its right to exist. The modern corporation, however, enjoys perpetual limited liability and permanent existence without any corresponding increase in public duty or obligation. This is how responsibility, they argue, was systematically externalized.
When corporations pollute, the public cleans up. When they crash the economy, taxpayers absorb the losses. When they exploit labor, communities pick up the social costs. But the most defining symptom of this decline, according to the sources, is the complete disappearance of personal consequences for the powerful.
Fines have been reduced to merely a predictable cost of doing business. They are paid by shareholders, which effectively punishes investors, not the specific executives who made the harmful decisions. The pamphlet highlights that after the 2008 collapse, major environmental disasters, or systemic labor fraud, executives might resign with a golden parachute, but they are rarely prosecuted.
There's no real personal deterrent.
There is virtually no jail time, no lifetime bans from finance, and therefore no real personal deterrence against systemic abuse.
So the pamphlet demands true accountability, starting with the premise that public money requires public obligations. If you take public support, You must submit to public responsibility.
Right. If a corporation receives taxpayer subsidies, defense contracts, or emergency bailouts, it owes the public more than just profit. It must be mandated to provide transparency, enforce fair labor practices, and demonstrate full tax compliance. Anything less is characterized by the author as corruption under a different name.
And the demand for personal accountability is key here. Executive liability for fraud, criminal consequences for systemic abuse, and mandated clawbacks of bonuses tied to destructive or harmful behavior. And the final, major demand is a return to rigorous antitrust enforcement.
The authors argue that concentrated power, whether it's held by the state or by private corporations, is inherently dangerous to liberty and the market. Antitrust laws, they insist, are fundamentally American, designed to ensure competition and prevent political capture. Breaking up monopolies and limiting the reach of megacorporations is presented not as a radical economic restructuring, but as restoring the necessary competitive discipline that the bailouts removed.
This brings us to the provocative thought that wraps up this entire analysis of corporate power and privilege. The civilization, the author posits, is collapsing not due to a lack of wealth, technology, or influence, but because the necessary balance has been lost.
The final challenging question posed by the sources is a powerful one, and it's directed entirely at you, the learner. The survival of the entire system, the American idea, depends entirely on whether the nation still has the will to bind power to responsibility. The pamphlet concludes that history offers two paths. Either power structures are reformed to align with public duty, or the civilization will simply fracture under the weight of unchecked private extraction.
And the ultimate challenge that emerges from this entire deep dive is defining patriotism, not by rhetoric or by financial success, but by responsibility when power is held.
And that is the thought to mull over. The claims we've analyzed challenge us to think about specific structural reforms outside of just breaking up monopolies or executive liability. What specific mechanisms or policies could logically restore the link between contribution and privilege in the modern American economy? What could ensure that those who profit the most from the stability, infrastructure, and protection of the civilization also bear a proportional and unavoidable share of its maintenance and its inevitable risk? That choice, the pamphlet argues, is what determines everything that comes next.